Hi everyone, and welcome to my updated Lightning Arrow Deadeye guide for patch 3.21 Crucible League. I've played this build in the past already. Back in 3.19 I already made a guide for the Lightning Arrow, but there have been some changes since then, lots of bow buffs in particular, and especially for this build there are some new fancy tweaks that you can do. I league started this build and so far this has been my only character and I had an absolute blast. It was one of the smoothest starts I ever had. And so far I've also defeated 5 out of the 7 Uber bosses, just missing Cortex and Exarch, which I'm also planning to do very soon, including some of the other Uber stuff like Simulacrum 30 for example. So generally this is not really a bossing build, it's like pretty much the opposite of a bossing build, but for me it was a personal goal to try to achieve that, which is also why I built this character very tanky. And in general, for a bow build, it feels relatively durable with the way that I made it. So I can run T16 maps no problem, of course, even juiced up. So even with Delirium and like rare or corrupted maps, this has been not really an issue since the start when I had like no currency invested into this build. I was able to complete the Atlas basically day one without really much trouble, just moving up in tiers. And by now that my character is pretty much finished with a net worth of, I don't know, maybe 30 divines or so, I feel very comfortable tackling everything that the game has to offer. So I'm going to give you an overview of my gear and then I'm going to go into the passive trees. I do have a PoB here that has also various steps, including first lap, second lap, etc. for leveling. And also these endgame setups here with some unique jewels like Lionized Fall and Thread of Hope. But there are these leveling steps here, and I also have the notes that I've updated with a bunch of information as well, part of what I'm discussing in this guide, but also just to have some extra info for you to check out when you need to. So most of the gear that I have equipped is actually self-crafted, with the exception of the rings and amulets, but most of the time I just use like a fractured base and some essence spamming, trying to get some good stuff, and that has actually worked out really well. So this is my bow. It is relatively strong, so I managed to get tier 1, tier 1, tier 3 on the prefixes with a fractured crit, and then I managed to unveil the double damage while focus. In general, I'm a big fan of focus, so I use that for my nuke phases. The reason for that is that in general, as a Lightning Arrow Deadeye, you are relatively squishy because you're Deadeye, and you don't really have that much time to really deal good damage. So the best way to really defeat endgame bosses is to use this nuke window with focus and, for example, Molten Shell up as a defense, so that you can tank bosses and stand point blank for the extra damage from the keystone here, and also for Vengeance Cascade. This is an anoint on the amulet, that is anoint only in fact. You need Amber gold for this, and it makes your projectiles return. And this has been massively buffed in the current patch, where projectiles always return to you even if they do not hit anything. So this makes it so that you just get more out of this than before, which was already the best anoint by far, and now it's even better. So you can see this here when you're spamming those arrows, they just keep flying all over the place and they come back. And like this, you just hit the same target multiple times. And there are other effects in this build that also allow you to do multi-hits. Lightning Arrow is an AoE skill, so you can see here those like blue explosions basically. And when you have Azenav's Mark, you can spawn a tornado and can spawn a hydrosphere. You can also get some other fancy utility stuff like a frost bomb to reduce the life regen for Maven encounters, for example, and a power charge on crit just for like, extra damage. And you can, for example, just spawn this tornado here, and that tornado can be hit, and this hit can then hit the boss. And vice versa. For example, you can hit the boss with your lightning arrow, and then your lightning arrows can jump to the tornado through chain, and you can get those double hits all the time. So this is a very powerful item that allows you to multi-hit with lightning arrow, and this is another reason why you want to stand very close to your target, at least when you're trying to nuke down bosses. So this all synergizes with focus, molten shell. A lot of other people also playing lightning arrow keep asking me why I'm doing so much more damage than them. And this is mostly the reason. It's the positioning and the timing of my flasks with the focus, with the molten shell and these kind of things. You have to try to stand as close as possible to the target. Let's say the map device here. So literally right in front of them, press your flask, press your molten shell and your focus, and you will do multiple times more damage than trying to attack something from even this distance away. You still don't really have the shotgunning effect, you don't have the point blank bonus, you don't have the tornado double hitting, and obviously your damage will be way, way lower compared to being able to stand here and nuke down a boss. Either way, let's return back to the gear and how I made it. So we have this bow here, I already talked about the prefixes. Once I had those, I did a prefix cannot be changed and aceling in Mastermind encounter, and I got the double damage while focused, then I just crafted the attack speed. Another good option is also critical strike multiplier when there's a rare or unique enemy nearby. This is actually what I had early on, but I felt like the extra attack speed was a bit helpful. I did learn later that a spine bow would have probably been a slightly better choice here because it has less crit, but overall more attacks per second. But I just went with the Harvey bow base. Both is fine, but I guess the spine bow feels a bit more smooth, especially for mapping. So keep that in mind. Then we have the gloves. They are also with a focus mod. I did this with a Veiled Chaos Orb. So we had the Fractured Suffix. I just spammed Veiled Chaos Orb. And then I did the prefixes with Eldritch Chaos and Eldritch Exalts and these kind of things until I had something like a decent life roll, and I crafted the +1 AoE gems here and put all my auras in there. Yeah, and most of the other stuff is also mostly essence spammed. For example, here I think I used a Chaos Res essence, and here we used a crit multi essence. I actually got very lucky with this quiver. This is probably worth quite a lot with the extra arrow. It has some decent stats, has good life, so the only stat that is useless here is the dexterity, but overall really, really solid item. Yeah, probably one of the most expensive items that I have equipped right now. But this additional arrow is not really so necessary, but it's like nice to have for better clear and slightly more single target damage. Then we just have like some crit multi, crit strike amulet here. I made this into a talisman, didn't really get anything. I actually tried this twice and didn't get anything twice really, but there are really good talisman effects and I didn't have like a good base, so I thought why not. Rings are mostly just res and stats and minus mana cost craft. I have this 2 times. Part of the reason why you want to have this mana cost craft, even if your mana is generally okay, is because first of all you don't need to run a mana flask at all, you don't have to worry about mana at all, and also it lowers the mana cost of your Manaforged arrows significantly so that they proc a lot more often. So this setup here has a 6 link that uses Manaforged arrows. I have this linked with Frenzy, with Ensnaring Arrow, and with Lightning Arrow. So I can actually clear maps just using this Lightning Arrow setup here that has only elemental damage of attacks and inspiration support to lower the cost even further. And like that, the Manaforged arrows that trigger automatically basically come out every time I attack. So you see this here, you see like the green arrows out of Frenzy, for example. When I attack again, they come out again. So there is a short cooldown of half a second on how often those Manaforged arrows can trigger. But especially when you're just like, running around or stutter stepping like this, you will basically trigger this almost every single time you attack. And the only times you don't get consistent Manaforged arrow triggers is when you're like literally standing and like spamming your attacks, and then it comes out like usually every second attack, maybe every third attack. And while in the past I used to have a ballista totem set up here for extra single target, I tried out this league and I was absolutely amazed by it. So you have the frenzy charges here, which you can get another way, for example from the quiver with the crit craft. And I have the ensnaring arrow here, which is just useful to have for like, yeah, another like 10% or so extra DPS on most single targets. And then I have a bit of extra AoE clear here, a bit of extra damage. So I did some napkin math on this, and depending on how often you trigger them, you can expect something like 20 to 50% more DPS using this setup here compared to having nothing basically. And most of the time when you're playing a ballista totem setup to try to get some more extra single target on endgame bosses, first of all you have to waste some time actually putting down those totems. And second, they can also die very easily, especially in Uber boss encounters. They usually don't really have like any chance to live. So I really like this Manaforged setup because it's completely, free of any thought basically. It just triggers. You don't have to worry about, putting down the totems, and it feels really good to use with some extra utility baked in. You could even get other stuff in there if you don't want to do any damage with this. You can even do like a cull, or you can do yet another extra like effect here that you can maybe get from another skill. So there are tons of options here. One thing that you might have noticed is I'm actually wearing full armor bases. So I have the Goliath gauntlets, I have the Goliath greaves, and I have a gladiator plate. I actually also crafted this to be like very, very high on armor. I just try to stack very high physical damage mitigation, and just standing here in hideout I have 32k armor. When I press my granite flask I have 50k, and in combat I have even more, because I have the Leech Master here, for example, with another 40% extra armor while leeching. So I go up to something like 60k plus or so armor, which makes this build very durable. And of course I have the capped resists, a bit overcapped even, so that I can run elemental weakness maps, no problem. I have 74 chaos res. That was actually a bit of an accident. I wasn't really intending to stack that much chaos res, but it did help on stuff like Uber Cyrus, for example. But I just ended up with a lot of chaos res. So that was kind of nice. Realistically, I think that going with something like around ±0 would be okay, just to feel like smooth while mapping. I know a lot of people like having element avoidance, but I feel this is pretty unnecessary. You can get most of the shock avoidance just from Soul of Garakan, which I usually use for mapping. For the Uber bosses, I was also using Rizlafa for the life flask charges. And you can get a chill reduction and immunity to freeze, just some sort of Brine King, which I just kept using all the way. And then there's only Ignite left, which doesn't really matter anyway. So I feel like elemental avoidance is not really that important, but you can get it, especially with the boots. I think there's an essence that allows you to get elemental ailment avoidance. So when you craft boots with Essence of Loathing, you can get up to 35%, and then you can get another 15% plus from an implicit. And then there is a unique jewel that I think that was introduced just this league that allows you to get the other 50%. And that gives you can have elemental element immunity. In terms of flasks, this build is actually very flexible. So I did mention the granite flask, so I just have this for extra armor. So I always go for increased effect and reduced duration. I also self-crafted these flasks, so we have the evasion here, we have the armor there, attack speed here, and reduced effect of curses on the Quicksilver. Actually, I never improved it, so this was actually supposed to be increased effect as well, but that's what I have now. And then I have like some instant recovery on low life and crafted blood immunity on my life flask. And for some of these boss encounters, I tend to throw in a few more life flasks. For example, Jade is relatively useless on those Uber bosses. And something like a granite might also not be so important. So you can just like throw in more life flasks and have a bit more recovery there. It's just kind of useful on some of these harder boss fights. But for typical mapping, not really an issue. In addition to all that, I am actually spell suppression capped. And I did this pretty much entirely from the tree. I only have the 5% here from the implicit on the gloves. It's because these are all armor bases. You cannot have any spell suppression. But it's very easy to do as a ranger. So we have Entrench here. We have Quick Step and the two small ones, and we have Inveterate. And this basically gives you 100% spell suppression already. So I just solved it all from the tree from like a few points, and just went ahead and crafting my gear with lots of resists, having the capped chaos res, etc. You can also go for armor evasion hybrid bases, at least on glove or boot slots, and maybe drop the chaos res there and these kind of things, and you could save a few points on the tree. But I was totally fine with that. For a long time, I was actually just running with non-capped spell suppression. I had something like 70% or so, and then just used the new mastery, chance to suppress spell damage is lucky. It's a very powerful tool to get pretty close to 100%. So for typical mapping, when you usually get hit by smaller attacks or spells, but more often, then this can be very useful. You don't really need to have the 100%. But of course, this is an endgame target, and you want to try to achieve that later on, especially when you do any kind of bossing. Spell suppression is extremely valuable. Now let's get into the passive tree here. This is a level 99 build. I have helped Alira, so I don't have the extra 2 passive points. And I also have the Line Eyes Fall here to convert the claw and dagger nodes into bone nodes up here. And I have the Thread of Hope here to get a lot of extra value from a bunch of really strong passives in the radius with the large ring. So this is something to keep in mind. The tree does look relatively similar, but you leave out the stuff here on the top, especially if you don't have these jewels. So this is something I put in relatively late, because this league they are very expensive compared to usual. Both the Thread of Hope and the Line Eyes Fall, I guess it's a bow league, so it's quite popular. It was like 6 divines on its own. But yeah, it's well worth it just to like do some endgame optimization, but I did this very late. So I can show you the leveling trees. This is how I started. So we just path here through the ranger area, mostly rushing down to precise technique and point blank very early. So this is for like level 30 something. Basically just going all the way down here. You can pick up the primal spirit, which helps a lot early on to just get your gem setups going, and also just have no mana issues in the early acts. Lightning Arrow is a relatively powerful skill on its own. And then in Act 2 we get Trinity support, so you can do Added Cold, Trinity, Lightning Arrow, and maybe once you get a 4-link you can do something like LMP or a Mirage Archer or something like that. And on top of that you can have some extra either Manaforged Arrow setup if you want to, but I did it with the Ballista Totem, at least for the early acts until later maps. I was still running Ballista Totem because I was used to that, but I think both will work. Either way, Precise Technique is a very powerful tool here for leveling, gives you 4% more attack damage. You only have to keep your accuracy rating higher than your maximum life, which is relatively easy to achieve as a ranger. So as long as you keep an eye on your accuracy rating and your life values, you can do that very easily. You can do that with Precision Aura, or you can also spec into some accuracy stuff. For example, here's Farsight, it gives you accuracy. If you really have to, you can take something like Accuracy here. And even the Mastery, there's like a Mastery that gives you lots of accuracy rating. And this will basically solve all your worries about this. And then obviously point blank here. We're going to keep this forever. And we're going to unspec Precise Technique later once you go crit after the campaign. Early on, it's just not really easy to stack up crit. But it is important to keep in mind that you also cannot deal ailments that easily when you don't crit. So for example, the shock on Lightning Arrow is very powerful. And also, for example, when you have Added Cold, you can freeze and chill, and you cannot do that if you're not critting. So keep an eye out for effects that give you a chance to shock or chance to freeze. Either, for example, from the Primeval Force wheel here, I'd like to pick up the 20% chance to freeze, shock, and ignite here, which you're going to see later in the tree. But also, for example, a flask can give you this chance to freeze and shock as well. So if you get one of those, you can hold on to it. Either way, up to level 58, second lab, we progress. We get the Onslaught here. This is something I really like. You just get Onslaught on kill. It has increased Onslaught effect. Just makes you way faster. That makes everything more smooth. And you start pathing up to some of those bow nodes here. So Master Fletcher gives you an extra arrow now. So does Multishot. So this is some stuff you want to pick up relatively early, because the extra arrows do help a lot with the AoE clear. And it makes it so that you don't really need to have greater multiple projectiles or these kind of things in your build. And later on, as a Deadeye, you also get the extra +2 projectiles. So you get 4 extra projectiles just from the tree and the Ascendancy. And this basically removes any need for extra arrows from other sources, even though they're still nice to have later, like I do on my quiver, for example. Then we have the third lab tree. Effectively, you just path up here towards the shadow. So we pick up the leech, we pick up the extra life, and maybe some masteries on the way. And also the shadow stuff here. So there's more elemental ailment stuff. There's extra life and some stats. It's just useful stuff to have early on. And we kind of keep the bottom part here as it is. Then we have the post-campaign crit swap. So at that point, you're going to unspec a few things here. So you see Farsight is gone. Precise Technique is gone. And you might not even need this accuracy stuff here anymore. That depends on what's your chance to hit. So at this point, you have to stack accuracy just to have a high chance to hit, but you don't really need to have it like higher than your life anymore. So keep that in mind. But you can also pick up, for example, the blind here. So blind is very powerful, gives you lots of extra crit, it gives you more evasion, gives enemies less evasion rating as well. So this is already helpful. And then you can pick up King of the Hill for the extra crit. You can pick up the crit stuff here on the shadow area. And you can also start working on spell suppression. And finally, working towards endgame, you can pick up even more damage stuff here. So this is the Uber Lab tree with Lethality, for example, and Heartseeker. It's very powerful once you have enough crit. And then this is like level 93 now. So you can just start filling up even more nodes in other places if you want to. So if you have leftover points and you don't have Lionized Fall yet, you can also pick up something like Survivalist, for example. You can pick up maybe a Frenzy Charge, you can pick up maybe a Jewel. So you can just, get some stuff there from various places. Or you can even go back and pick up Farsight, which is also relatively powerful. So there's a bunch of options if you have some need for extra damage or extra utility or something like that. And the Ascendancy progression looks like this. So we start with the Gathering Winds for the Tailwind. Then we get the chain. This already gives you like insane clear during campaign. Then the +2 projectiles. And lastly, we have the extra mark effect here. This also gives you some nice damage reduction for mapping. And it's just very, very powerful on single targets with the sniper's mark. And here we have the completed skill setups. So first of all, the main link, the VAR Lightning Arrow. The VAR version is new and it's relatively useful. So especially early on when you're kind of weak, this is some nice single target burst. Later on, I didn't really care much about it anymore. So you can also go with like a non-VAR version if you want to fill up your other VAR skills more easily, for example, like VAR Molten Shell. So that's kind of up to you. I just stuck with it now. I have the fork for the extra AoE clear. This is something that is not really high priority, so this is like the last link basically. But Trinity, super powerful, is like the best support skill in the game basically. You just need to make sure that your elemental damage types are a bit balanced, so you can see this here in game. I mentioned that, for example, during the campaign you want to use added cold damage because Lightning Arrow already has a lot of lightning damage, and like this you can balance out those two elements. And you can see it here now. I don't have added cold in my setup. I just have it from the bow itself and maybe some other sources of elemental damage, for example on the ring or an amulet or these kind of things. Usually don't have to worry too much about it as long as your cold and your lightning rolls on your bow are fairly balanced. And you see this here, cold damage is 2,600 to 5,000 and lightning is 800 to 11,000. And this is totally fine. You can also do it with fire, but fire is generally a little bit weaker because of the hydrosphere giving you lightning and cold exposure. So those two elements have slightly higher value in terms of DPS output. You can also do it with lightning and fire if you want to. You just need to have two of them kind of balanced so that you get the Trinity effect. Mirage Archer is always great. So Lightning Arrow, Trinity, Mirage Archer is kind of like the 3-link combo. Then you can do something like elemental damage of attacks or added cold during campaign until you drop added cold. And then you have Inspiration, so for reduce mana cost, extra damage, extra crit, very useful. And the fork for the better AoE clear finally. And for Uber bosses in particular, I swap out fork and I go with Barrage. You see that this gives you 128% DPS, so this is pretty massive. And then the combined DPS, this is on pinnacle bosses, is like 5 million. And this is, you know, like ×2 again, basically from Vengeance Cascade. And then ×2 again from hitting the tornado. So yeah, it's pretty hard to really quantify the overall damage output on this build, but I guess that my DPS is somewhere in the range of 10 to 30 million doing a focus nuke. So this is pretty useful, and basically every single map boss evaporates in like a second. I've done even juiced up like Elder Slayer invitations, I've done the Breach Lord invitations, these kind of things, and yeah, stuff just melts when you tank them point blank with everything up. They just die, basically. Here I have the Manaforged link, so I already talked about this earlier. I'm not going to go much into detail, but there are some other options you can do, especially utility options. For example, if you don't want to use this Asenath's Mark stuff with power charge and crit, you can put a power charge and crit here as well, and rely less on the actual damage output of the Manaforged arrows and have more utility here. You can put a Cull, etc. Then we have the Asenath's Mark setup. This is a helm that you should definitely acquire as early as possible. This is actually initially the first thing I bought once I was out of campaign. It was like 20C or so. Not really that much. But the constant tornado spawns are extremely powerful because of this double hit effect. The Hydrosphere gives you also extra hits and also the exposure. And the Frost Bomb is very useful because you have to do a lot of Maven Witnesses and Maven keeps healing bosses. And this prevents that. Or there could be maps where you have consecrated ground and they need to fight like really big essences and they're hard to kill. And they have the regenerating Arch-Nemesis mod, these kind of things. So it's just really nice to have Frostbomb. And the power charge and crit, I put them in here. Early on, when you don't have Asenath's Mark yet, for example in campaign, you can also just do an Arcanist brand. So you do Arcanist brand, Tornado, and Hydrosphere, and then maybe an increased duration if you can. And like this, you can kind of have the same effect, but you have to cast it manually. But once you can, you want to get this. Next we have mobility and the mark, so I have Blink Arrow and Flame Dash as two mobility skills. I do have relatively high movement speed, so with Flask it feels relatively good. But yeah, like this you can just like teleport around all the time. They don't even share cooldown, so it's quite nice. And I run Flame Dash because I want to do a lot of bossing with this, and Flame Dash makes you invulnerable while traveling, which normal dash doesn't. So this is very useful when you do bossing. But you can also just go with normal dash if you like. And then we have Mark on Hit Sniper's Mark. so we don't have to worry about it. And here we have a Molten Shell in the gloves, and then we have the auras in the gloves as well. So Grace, Determination, Defiance Banner. Basically, my entire evasion rating is coming from Grace itself. So if I turn this off, you can see here I have 30k right now, goes down to 9k. And without the flask, I don't have like any evasion rating. So at the very least, you want to have that Grace, if not the flask as well, because the extra evasion rating just helps so much to stay alive while mapping. And that's also it for this guide here, so hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask away in the comments. Otherwise, you can also stop by on the stream. I'm still streaming some PvE right now until I'm probably going to go back to Sunday 3 and Variety before Diablo 4 comes. And also want to highlight again that we have these notes here. Wish you good luck with your own Lightning Arrow build if you're playing this. I had a lot of fun with this. I've played this multiple times already, and in 3.21 this is definitely the strongest version of the build that we have seen. And it has been a blast all the way. So hope you like this one. Subscribe if you want to see more PoE content in the future. Also go check out my main channel. This is actually just my secondary channel. I do have another one dedicated more to Diablo content, especially with Diablo 4 coming up. This might be something. And I want to thank all of you for watching. See you guys next time.